All right, come on in, everybody. Welcome back to the Holler. I'm Justin. As you know by now, we're tnholler.com is where you can find us at the TN Holler on Twitter and Facebook. We also have hollers all across the state, and that's thanks to your support. We really do appreciate it. Your small dollar monthly donations keep us going. We also want to shout out Elisa Parker. If you're buying and selling in Middle Tennessee, check out Elisa. Supporting us through her is a great way to do it and spread the word. We really appreciate her support. So I think most of you saw the State of the State this week. We were up there covering it. There was a big protest. Appreciate all the people who went out to make their voices heard with Governor Lee. Obviously, a lot of what Governor Lee talked about, was spin. A lot of things he left out, like, for instance, the 22,000 dead of COVID in Tennessee and our, nation worst death rate. Didn't even mention it. But one of the things that I think bumped a lot of people the wrong way was, or at least bumped a lot of people, was when he mentioned what he called informed patriotism and a push to essentially turn Tennessee kids into what he called informed patriots through a partnership with a college in Michigan called Hillsdale College. And so once that happened, everybody was like, what is this Hillsdale College thing? And we all sort of started digging into it. One of the first things I found was Michigan College president calls minorities dark ones from a few years back, and that is Larry Arnn, who I've come to now know a little bit. And then a few people said, oh, you should reach out to Ann Nelson, who has written a book called Shadow Network, and it's about the radical right, media money, and the secret hub of the radical right, and talks about Hillsdale College. Ann is joining us right now. Ann, how are you?
Fine. Glad to say hello to Tennessee.
Absolutely. So everybody, let us know that you're out there. We can see your questions and comments as we have this conversation. And tell me a little bit about what made you decide to write Shadow Network, and then I'd like to talk about a couple of things. One is Hillsdale College, and then also about the school board attacks, which you have written extensively about how they're coordinated. And honestly, I feel like all of it is kind of under the umbrella of attacks on our public schools and a push to basically steer the massive amounts of money that are in public education towards private schools and private Christian schools, to be specific.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Oklahoma and I go back there quite often. And when I was there some years ago, I turned on the radio and there was a fundamentalist radio show on that was very overtly political, that was really reciting all kinds of untruths, shall we say, about the Democratic presidential candidate. And I was puzzled because I thought it was supposed to be religious. I thought it was supposed to be nonprofit, and not get into electoral politics. And I looked up the station, and that led to discovering a network of these radio stations all across the South and into other states as well. And then that led to discovering that these radio networks were run by people who were high-ranking members of the Council for National Policy. And that is a 40-year-old organization that is a combination of fossil fuel interests and fundamentalist religious figures. It started with a bunch of televangelists in 1981. And they set out to take the United States back, in their minds, to really the vision of the past, which would have been pretty much a white Protestant patriarchy in a way that is not really corresponding to our modern society. So I wrote the book about it, and I have seen them come up in the news in all kinds of ways, including on January 6th, including the role of Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, who's a member, pretty much every week you can find something in the major newspapers that go back to their plan of taking the country.
So you started digging in. How long did the book take you to write?
Well, the way I work is I take a few years of collecting information and putting it into a grid. And then I wrote it pretty quickly. And the new paperback edition just came out a year ago, less than a year ago, with a new chapter on January 6th, and the various disinformation campaigns that these groups are running, including COVID disinformation, which is really accounting for an unforgivable number of lives.
What role does Hillsdale College play in all of this?
Well, the strategy of the Council for National Policy, and where they outperform the Democrats in so many ways, and the traditional Republican Party, right? Because they have purged traditional Republicans from a lot of local and state offices in order to replace them with hard right members of their own clan. And they have very specific functions. So the donors, the big donors, like the DeVos family, as in Betsy DeVos, and oil interests, and the Bradley Foundation are there, the political strategists, etc. Now, Hillsdale College occupies their most elite rung of their university partners. There's some Bible colleges, there's some small colleges in the Midwest, but Hillsdale is where they try to pin their intellectual pretensions, I would say. And Hillsdale has its own radio station, steps away from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where the members of the Council for National Policy can go and do their radio broadcasts very conveniently, and network into the Council for National Policy media, like Salem Media, like Bot Radio, and so on. And they put out a journal which pushes their ideological viewpoint. It's called Imprimis, and it's sent without request to millions of unknowing subscribers, many of them attorneys. So they've gotten more and more involved in pushing back against, first of all, public education, second of all, teachers' unions, third of all, the 1619 project of educating school children in public schools about the history of slavery and race relations in the United States. And so you can't just make this a political platform. They've also needed to have some intellectual window dressing, and that's where Hillsdale comes in.
So Hillsdale is very connected. The articles about all the imprints that they have in Washington had a hand in, lobbying to get themselves a carve out in the GOP tax bill. Trump brought in Larry Arnn, who's the president, to head up the 1776 Commission report, which Biden did away with on day one, but it basically was sort of a whitewashing of our history in report form. How do you think someone like Governor Lee gets mixed up with someone like Larry Arnn and Hillsdale? And could it have something to do with Betsy DeVos, who we know has a link and a tie to Hillsdale College and has also been very active here in Tennessee with helping Governor Lee get his vouchers passed? And then I want to let you know about something that we just learned, where basically Larry Arnn was on tape end of last year in Franklin, saying that Governor Lee has asked him to bring 100 charter schools to Tennessee. So how does Governor Lee get mixed up with Larry Arnn?
Well, this network of organizations that are connected to the Council for National Policy have a lot of activity on the state level. So, for example, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, leverages state legislation and will try it out in the courts of one state and then take it to another. So this is one area where you've got a lot of abortion legislation, and some of it really draconian, spreading across the country. But what you have to realize about this movement is that the architects of it were not content with changing a few state laws. They wanted to change the whole culture. So some of their foundational documents, which I record in the book, say they want to take over education. They want to take over business and popular entertainment and higher education. What they don't want is this idea of the young children of America being educated in ways they object to. Now, they've tried many different avenues. Betsy DeVos hasn't only been active in Tennessee. She's also pushed her educational agenda, really trying to change both the curriculum and the structure of schools and the power center of schools in Michigan. That was, since she's from Michigan, and is very deeply rooted in a fundamentalist religious sect there, that was her laboratory. But for example, in Oklahoma, which has had some miserable levels of funding for public schools in the recent past, you had a group of public school teachers who ran for the state legislature. Betsy DeVos's organization came into Oklahoma and spent six figures to defeat these public school teachers for the state legislature. So they're, if you scratch the surface in Tennessee, I promise you, you will find other states where the same thing is being promoted. Now, if Tennessee's governor was the first one to, well, he wouldn't have been the first one, because this is the same project that Betsy DeVos promoted in Michigan. So you're just trying to seed this approach and create this curriculum for children where this vision of America and the American past is very politically colored, shall we say.
Right. So I'm just going to play right now for everybody the clip of Governor Lee. This was Governor Lee at the State of the State this week, talking about what he wants to do in Tennessee with Hillsdale College and how he wants our kids to be informed patriots.
Now more than ever, it's important that we teach true American history.
Right. So he says true American history. Meanwhile, he just signed a quote unquote anti-CRT bill to whitewash that history and essentially threaten to fine teachers who teach it in a way that he doesn't like.
And non-political. I'm proud of the informed patriots that are graduating from our Tennessee schools, but there's still more to be done. 2 years ago, I traveled to Hillsdale College, what I believe are champions of American exceptionalism. For decades, Hillsdale College has been a standard bearer in quality curriculum and in the responsibility of preserving American liberty. I believe their efforts are a good fit for Tennessee, and we are formalizing a partnership with Hillsdale to expand their approach to civics education and K-12 education in Tennessee. Informed patriotism should stretch beyond K-12. Many states, colleges, and universities have become centers of anti-American thought.
So I guess my question to you, Ann, would be, you see this guy saying this, right? And he's also in the same speech trying to present himself as a friend to public education, but he's bringing in this college and Larry Arnn, and we now know is planning a network of charter schools. Do you think Governor Lee is actually a friend of public education, or is his goal really to take over education in the country and really privatize it and steer people away from it?
Well, the charter school movement has been kind of a stalking horse for this movement. And my guess is that it's kind of the thin edge of the wedge, because that's the way that you remove control from traditional school boards and the teachers unions and really professional educators in many cases. And you put the control of the curriculum into the hands of more politicized parties. And I think that Americans have not been very focused on the politics of school boards in the past. So it made it kind of a low-hanging fruit for this movement, right? I mean, you've had all kinds of situations all across the country where you've organized political attacks, some of them even physical, on school boards and school board members. And these candidates who are being pushed by the movement, and that result in threats and even cases of things like vermin deposited on the doorsteps of the traditional school board members. So it's a real power grab on a hyper local level. And my belief, which I've been reporting on and beginning to document, is that it's not just about curricula, it's not just about schools, it's a thin edge of a wedge into local politics, where the school boards can become feeders for local political offices, which can then feed into plans for the 2022 midterms and the 2024 elections, where you'll have this base of highly partisan people, in many cases imposing their own definition of education and patriotism and truth on the rest of the community. And I see that as very dangerous.
Absolutely. And, again, we'll have a clip and I'll play it in a little bit, but Larry Arnn said that Governor Lee asked him for 100 charter schools in Tennessee. And you mentioned the attacks on the school boards. That's been a pretty heavy topic in Tennessee, especially in Williamson County where I live. And, the center of it is this Moms for Liberty group who, have been trying to get books banned. They were obviously at the center of the masking debate. And they are now, I think, intertwined with this push to bring charter schools. We know that the charter school group has already filed applications in Williamson and Montgomery County. And the secretary of the one, at least in Williamson County, maybe both, is a donor to the PAC that basically is linked to Moms for Liberty and Tennessee Stand. So it's all together. Now, you call Moms for Liberty, or not necessarily specifically them, but a lot of these school board attack groups astroturfed, like they're part of a bigger structure. It's not just this organic grassroots group. What's your evidence for that? And my other question would be, do you think that the members of these groups even know that they're a part of something like that? Or is it possible these moms think they're in some grassroots effort and are actually pawns in a bigger game?
So one of the characteristics of this movement is that they're very good at inventing and discarding and reinventing and renaming organizations. That's their MO. So in tracking them over 40 years, I find the same individuals and the same donors appearing and disappearing and showing up again. So you've got the Tea Party Patriots involved, you've got this group, you've got that group. And one advantage that they have in this is that if you have the Moms for Liberty and you have another organization, the County Citizens Defending Freedom, which is also active in this area, and various others, you don't have the filings of their donor activity if they're nonprofit, or their tax filings, because there's like a year's lag time. And sometimes they're gone before then. So one way that you can relate them is who they announce their partners are. And they're a core council for national policy organizations that will appear on their websites. But it's really, journalistically speaking, it's a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
And I believe that's quite intentional. But another way to track them is to see which media platforms they appear on. Because you have some where it's like Salem Media, Breitbart, Daily Caller, etc., American Voices on Facebook, where if they're promoted there and they're given this platform to make their speeches, you can easily surmise that there's a direct connection there. And by the way, you will never hear a representative of the other side, such as the teachers union or academic experts from other institutions, contesting what they say. It is what we call unidirectional messaging, or some might call it propaganda.
Right. Well, generally when it comes to these things, it feels like the old axiom of follow the money is, at the root of it all. And I just keep going back to how much money is in public education, how a lot of these charter school companies are, wanting to get their hands on it. You know, that seems to be sort of a through line here. And, you know, so I guess my question is, with Larry Arnn and Hillsdale College, do you think it's possible to track the money? Do you think it's possible? Like, is it all dark money? Is it disclosed? Like, how would you get to the bottom of what's going on? Is the money a clue?
So I wanted to go back to your earlier question about whether the members of these groups know how they're being used.
Sure.
And because that's a very important question. And I would say that in many, many cases, they don't. I think that there are so many people, and let's put it in context, right? It's we're now into another year of COVID. Parents, especially parents of young children, are stressed. They're it's a very difficult situation that seems to go on and on. So they're easy marks for people who want to exploit that frustration and those emotions. And I feel as though they've been preyed upon. And really, this movement taking over the school boards and pushing this curriculum is related to the anti-vaxxing and anti-masking
Yeah.
campaigns that are run by these related organizations. And there seems to be a very strong impulse to create as much disruption and chaos as
Sure.
possible, and ultimately to undermine trust in our institutions.
Right. That's the point. Exactly. And to what end, right? They want to undermine trust. It's all a part of it, from the book banning to the masking to, what we're talking about with the charter schools. For, all of it is to undermine faith in our public school system, in our institutions, because when you do that, you can then steer the resources away from that. And I do think it's all part of the same whole here. And I'm not sure if a lot of the people who are fighting these fights realize that they're pawns in that game, but that I agree with you. I think that's the game.
Well, I mean, why else would these organizations tell their supporters not to get vaccinated? Right? How brutal an exploitation is that? And now we have several 100,000 Americans who've died unnecessarily because of this disinformation distributed through these media platforms. And as you go through trusted circles, and they started out with churches, especially with fundamentalist churches, recruited pastors. That's one cohort where they drove them to the polls to get them to vote against not just their local politicians, but to undermine trust in universities, undermine trust in the CDC and Dr. Fauci, right? When they sow this chaos, they win people over to the idea that they have to vote for an alternative, even if the alternative is really what is sowing the chaos and the distrust. And that's where it's so dangerous to our democracy. Now, in terms of the money, it is very hard to trace the money. You have some major players. As I said, the DeVos family has money all over this field. And you can go on to sites that record foundation activity and see where they've invested it.
They've given hundreds of thousands of dollars here in Tennessee alone. Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
multiply that by the states. This
Right.
is major, but they're sitting on a fortune of $6 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got a lot to work with. Then you've got the Bradley Foundation, which has also been extremely active. But beyond that, you've got organizations like the National Christian Foundation, which has annual meetings called The Gathering. And there's a very good piece that just came out today on Flux, going through their activities. And you're looking at, in past years, another $14 billion of dark money spent in this area.
Right.
So let's face it, in terms of their expenditures, Tennessee and my state of Oklahoma are very small potatoes. You can buy a seat on the state legislature for very little. You can buy a seat on the school board for much less.
Right. There's no better investment for, wealthy donors than a politician, because for not that much money, you buy control of these people who are going to change a law or two, and suddenly your pockets are going to be full, whether it's a change in the tax code or, charter schools. I want to play the clip before I let you go, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I definitely plan to read the book. I haven't yet, but I encourage everybody to read it. It's called Shadow Network. This is Larry Arnn, the president of Hillsdale College, talking to a group in Franklin about education in American politics, September of last year. And this is what he said about Governor Lee.
The governor of Tennessee has talked me into a commitment to start 50 charter schools in Tennessee by his sell-by date. And we're going to try to do that. It's really hard because to be effective as a leader and a teacher in a charter school, you have to know what education is, and almost nobody does anymore. And we think we can do it. I mean, anybody want to be a school headmaster?
He then goes on to say that Lee asked him to start 100, and he said, "Oh no, we can only do 50." So and that's obviously that's the same governor who's now saying, "Oh, I'm going to put $1 billion more into our public education kitty, but only essentially if you okay this program, the student-led funding, which would then head towards down the road towards vouchers and then eventually towards charter schools." So, and meanwhile, this is something to keep in mind. Last session, Governor Lee took over or started a statewide charter school approval board, which has already overruled local communities that don't want charter schools. Then they appeal to the state level, and Governor Lee has control of that board that has overruled local groups that didn't want a charter school to come in. So he's got control of the approval process. He's getting control of the funding, and he's having his buddies open the schools where it will end up. Now, I don't care what party you're in. That is cronyism at least. And it should concern you, especially if you have kids in public school. We saw when the vouchers happened last year, and all of the Republicans didn't want vouchers in their districts. They only voted for it in Memphis and Nashville, which is where the Democrats are and the people of color are. So when you hear Larry Arnn saying that, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that this is a way of strong arming a form of indoctrination onto our next generations. And these are the same kinds of organizations that say that our school children shouldn't have access to books like by Toni Morrison, right? The Nobel Prize winning African-American author who's one of the great voices of the 20th century. They shouldn't have access to books about the Holocaust. They're wanting to form this stunted generation of young adults who don't even know what happened in their own country, because, by the way, nothing happened before 1776, especially not the introduction of slavery, because we don't like to talk about that. So you're going to have, in Oklahoma, there's a bill that's been proposed to make the Bible the state book of Oklahoma. And I deeply apologize to my Muslim friends in Oklahoma, because it's really not what they came to the United States expecting. You've got all kinds of measures of censorship and distortions of language saying they're looking for freedom, but they're constricting the freedom of everyone else. So I would really urge your listeners to pay close attention to what's going on in their local school boards, in the charter schools, and in these state races for the state legislature, which doesn't get a lot of attention, doesn't get much priority in the state capitol, in the national press. But I think it's really where a lot of the battle for preserving our democracy will be.
That's really well said. And thanks so much for joining us. Shadow Network is the book. Check it out, everybody. We definitely hope to stay in touch with you, especially as this Hillsdale stuff plays out, and maybe you can come on and tell us more about what's going on down the line.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ann. So that's Ann Nelson. Shadow Network is the book. Check it out. Just to talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll answer our friend Carlos, who, as always, is here trolling us with his talking points that he heard over on Fox. this just feels like corruption to me. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, you know, to have a governor having somebody bring in 100 charter schools into the state while we already underfund our schools to the tune of $1.5 billion a year. We're 44th in the nation in per pupil spending, and that's what this guy's focused on. And oh, by the way, he's only going to put in that extra money if he gets his way with the student-led funding that we know came from ALEC, which Ann just mentioned. You know, it's all right there for you to see it. And the culture war stuff is really just the way they keep us at each other's throats and make us easier to control. And so, you know, I would defy anybody to come on here and tell me they think 100 charter schools from a company in Michigan that, you know, has no roots in Tennessee to come indoctrinate our kids with informed patriotism, which at the end of the day is really deformed patriotism because it's not the truth. And, you know, I see one of the things Carlos said was that, you know, schools are indoctrinating students, the radical left indoctrinating students. Well, you know, that indoctrination that Governor Lee said is happening on campus, that's just them actually learning truth about what happened. You know, what we're talking about here is slavery and systemic racism and white privilege. I mean, these are real things, you know, that they've now called critical race theory and painted as the boogeyman and said that, oh, we're anti-American if we talk about these things. No, we're actually more patriotic when we talk about the problems with our country and want to get better. It's not anti-American to tell the truth about where we've come from. It's anti-American to attack our country. And the same people who are fighting the fight that you're talking about, Carlos, those are the people that just attacked our country. Are you as upset about that? Governor Lee was pictured in a Confederate uniform. They just tried to keep a KKK Grand Wizard bust that we finally got removed this year in our capital. That's anti-American, literally. But you want to talk about, no, we can't talk about slavery or the 1619 Project or somehow diversity, equity, and inclusion is the boogeyman because we're trying to right some wrongs that this country has on its record very clearly. So, you know, at the end of the day, this is what we're talking about today is an assault on public schools. It's a war on our teachers. And it's a heist. It's really a heist because there's a lot of money in public education and they're trying to steer that money to private schools, especially Christian schools. And Betsy DeVos on a radio interview said that her mission was to quote unquote advance God's kingdom by steering public funds to private Christian schools. And Governor Lee is her accomplice in that. So you may not care about that. Like you may think that's a good idea, that you'd rather spend the money that we send to public schools on private Christian schools. But most people don't want that. Most people don't want to steer public dollars to private schools that way. That is not popular. That's why he stands there and he pretends to be a fan and an ally of public schools. He pretends that, but he's not. And now we have the receipts. And so what's going to happen? I don't know. I think this should be a story. Carlos, now you're just, you know, you're talking about the whoopee thing. Like now you're just making no sense. The Jews aren't a race. I don't. I mean, you're talking about the whoopee thing. You're just off on a tangent. Hopefully you come here to troll us, to actually learn something and not just to troll us. Otherwise, why are you here? You're wasting your time. Go do something else. Like you're just bored. But if you want to come here and actually hear what we have to say, great. But if you're going to come here and then start talking about the whoopee thing, I'm not here to talk about the whoopee thing. That was dumb on her part. She apologized. We're moving on. You know, they suspended her. That's up to them. Great. But here we're talking about public schools in Tennessee, how we make them better, and how Governor Lee is an enemy of them. And that much is very clear. Whether you want to see it or not is up to you. Hope everybody has a great day. We'll talk to you soon.